What I'm about to recount isn't pleasant. It's not a ghost story meant to make you jump at shadows, nor a creature feature designed for cheap thrills. This is different. It's about the quiet places, the deep wilderness areas we romanticize, thinking them pristine, untouched. But understand this: nature isn't always nurturing. Sometimes it's alien. Sometimes it develops appetites, and sometimes what you find deep in the woods isn't solitude, but something ancient, aware, and profoundly wrong. I learned this lesson hard in a place the old maps barely acknowledged, a place that felt like the world had forgotten it, or perhaps had been made to forget it. My background is in field biology, specialized in remote ecological surveys. Companies, governments, sometimes they need baseline data before they drill or log, or sometimes, thankfully, before they designate an area for preservation. It's often solitary work, long stretches off-grid, relying on your senses, your equipment, and your nerve. I've spent weeks alone in Alaskan tundra, navigated swamps thick enough to swallow a man whole, tracked wildlife through deserts that would cook the unprepared. I thought I'd seen the extremes of isolation, the raw indifference of the natural world. I was wrong. The place I'm talking about wasn't indifferent. It was attentive. The contract was unusual from the start. A privately funded environmental group wanting a detailed survey of a region they called the Mire, a vast wetland ecosystem tucked deep in a mountainous region generally considered impenetrable somewhere back east. Poorly mapped, historically avoided by local indigenous tribes according to fragmented records, and completely undeveloped. The goal was ostensibly to document unique flora and fauna for potential conservation efforts. The pay was exceptionally good, almost suspiciously so, covering several months of intensive fieldwork. I'd be dropped by helicopter at a designated base camp, a small, prefabricated cabin with supplies and satellite communication gear. Then, radio silence except for weekly check-ins. Standard procedure for deep remote work, but the location, the lack of existing data, it felt slightly off. Still, the challenge appealed to my professional curiosity, and frankly, the money was too good to refuse. The flighting was revealing. We flew for hours over increasingly dense, unbroken forests, then ranges of rugged, inhospitable-looking hills. Finally, the terrain dipped into a vast, basin-like depression, miles across, choked with wetlands, blackwater rivers snaking through dense stands of cypress and unfamiliar broadleaf trees, the Mire. Even from the air, it looked stagnant. The water wasn't the healthy dark tea color of normal blackwater swamps. It had a weird, yellowish, almost oily sheen. The greens of the foliage seemed too lurid, almost sickly, interspersed with patches of an unsettling grayish-purple fungus clinging to tree trunks like grotesque velvet. The pilot, a grizzled veteran who flew these backcountry routes, was unusually quiet, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape below with an expression I couldn't quite read. Unease? Or just concentration? As we descended towards the small clearing where the cabin stood, a sudden, oppressive silence seemed to fall, the roar of the rotors somehow dampened by the atmosphere below. The cabin was basic but functional. Solar panels, water filtration, stacks of preserved food, survey equipment, satellite phone. Standard remote setup. The pilot unloaded my gear quickly, barely meeting my eye. Weekly check-ins, sharp, he muttered before climbing back into the helicopter. Don't wander too far off the survey grids. Then he was gone, the sound of the rotors fading rapidly, leaving me in a silence that felt absolute, heavy, and deeply unnatural. Usually, even in remote areas, there's a background hum. Insects, birds, wind through the trees. Here, nothing. Just a profound stillness that pressed in on the ears. It wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. The first few days were dedicated to setting up, calibrating equipment, and making short reconnaissance trips around the immediate vicinity of the cabin. The air was thick, humid, carrying a strange Swedish odor beneath the expected smell of damp earth and vegetation. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was pervasive, cloying. The silence persisted. I saw no birds, heard no frogs or insects, which was incredibly bizarre for a wetland ecosystem. It was as if the entire area was holding its breath. The plant life was odd. Familiar species grew alongside things I couldn't readily identify. Ferns with strange geometric patterns on their fronds, vines that seemed to pulse with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm. And the fungus, it was everywhere. Not just the gray-purple velvet on the trees, but other varieties too. Large, fleshy-looking mushrooms in vibrant, unnatural colors, electric blue, bile yellow, blood red, pushing up through the mire. Some pulsed faintly with a dim bioluminescence even during the day. It was fascinating from a biological perspective, but also deeply unsettling. It felt wrong, unhealthy, like the ecosystem was running a fever. I started the survey work, laying out transects, taking soil and water samples, setting up motion-activated cameras. The water samples confirmed the visual oddity, high levels of unidentified organic compounds, giving it that yellowish, oily quality. Soil samples showed unusual fungal saturation, mycelial networks running deeper and denser than anything I'd encountered before. The silence remained absolute, broken only by my own movements, or the occasional splash as I navigated the soggy terrain. Days bled together in a haze of humidity, strange sights, and that oppressive, watching silence. I started feeling isolated in a way I never had before. Not just physically remote, but psychically cut off, as if the mire itself was a barrier. Then I found the first truly disturbing sign. About a mile north of the cabin, deep in a particularly dense thicket choked with pulsating fungi, I found a deer carcass. Not unusual in itself for predators or natural causes. But this was different. The deer wasn't just dead, it was incorporated. The gray-purple fungus had completely enveloped it, not just growing on it, but seemingly merging with it. Tendrils of mycelium threaded through the hide, into the muscle, even seeming to replace bone in places. The deer's form was still recognizable, but it looked less like a decaying carcass and more like a grotesque sculpture of flesh and fungus seamlessly integrated. There was no smell of rot, only that sweetish, cloying odor endemic to the mire, now intensified. Around the carcass, the ground was covered in a thick carpet of the stuff pulsing faintly. I backed away slowly, a cold dread creeping up my spine. This wasn't normal decomposition. This was assimilation. The mire wasn't just growing strange things, it was consuming, changing, integrating what fell within its borders. And I was miles deep inside those borders alone, with the silence listening. Seeing the fungus-integrated deer shifted my perspective entirely. This wasn't just an ecological survey anymore. It felt like I'd stumbled into a slow-motion biological horror story. The silence of the sallow mire no longer felt empty, but pregnant, the stillness hiding an alien process of consumption and transformation. Every patch of the luridly colored fungi, every strangely patterned fern, every vine that seemed to pulse with a hidden rhythm, now looked sinister. Was the entire ecosystem infected, directed by this pervasive, assimilating fungal network? Was the sweetish, cloying odor the scent of its digestion? The thought was deeply disturbing, violating basic biological principles I'd built my career on. I became more cautious, more wary during my surveys. I avoided the densest patches of fungus, paid closer attention to the subtle changes in the environment. I started noticing other things. Areas where the ground felt spongy, unnaturally yielding, as if the mycelial network beneath was thick and hollow. Strange, geometric patterns occasionally appearing in patches of mud or algae, too precise to be natural formations, looking almost like circuitry or sigils. And the silence. Sometimes I thought I could feel a low vibration through the soles of my boots, a deep, thrumming resonance coming from the earth itself, too low to be truly heard but felt as a physical sensation. Was this the heartbeat of the mire? My weekly check-ins with the outside world via satellite phone became lifelines, brief connections to normalcy. I reported my findings, the strange flora, the silence, the unusual water and soil composition, even mentioning the deer carcass, phrasing it carefully as unusual fungal colonization. The responses from the environmental group funding the project were oddly muted. They acknowledged my reports, asked few follow-up questions, and simply urged me to continue the survey, focusing on cataloging species diversity. Their lack of alarm, their almost detached curiosity, felt increasingly strange. Were they aware of the mire's true nature? Was this conservation survey merely a pretext for something else? The motion-activated cameras yielded unsettling results. Most nights, nothing. No deer, no raccoons, no bears, not even insects drawn to the infrared light. Further evidence of the unnatural lack of fauna. But occasionally a camera would trigger, capturing distortions. Strange blurs of movement too fast to resolve. Patches of fog or mist forming and dissipating rapidly in specific locations, seemingly independent of weather conditions. And sometimes shapes. vague, indistinct forms moving just at the edge of the frame, obscured by foliage or darkness, shapes that didn't conform to any known animal. Watching the footage felt like glimpsing figures moving behind a frosted glass window, tantalizingly close, frustratingly obscure, deeply unnerving. One night, exhaustion and unease warring within me, I was jolted awake in the cabin not by a sound, but by a change in the quality of the silence. It felt closer, more focused. I lay frozen in my bunk, straining my ears. Nothing. Then a soft, wet, slithering sound coming from directly outside the cabin wall, like something heavy and boneless dragging itself across the damp ground. My heart hammered against my ribs. I slowly reached for the heavy flashlight I kept beside the bunk. The slithering stopped, replaced by a faint, rhythmic tapping against the cabin's thin metal wall right near my head. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate, exploratory. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped me. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. What was out there? There were no large predators known in this region, nothing that should be exhibiting this kind of behavior. The tapping continued for what felt like an eternity, slow, methodical testing. Then silence again. After several agonizing minutes, the soft slithering sound resumed, moving away from the cabin, fading back into the oppressive stillness of the mire. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, sitting rigid in my bunk, flashlight beam trained on the door, ears straining for any returning sound. Whatever was out there, it knew I was inside. It was probing, investigating. The barrier between observer and observed was dissolving. The next day, I found it. On the damp ground outside the cabin wall where the tapping had occurred, there was a trail of thick, yellowish, translucent slime, glistening like oil in the weak sunlight. And pressed into the mud beside the slime trail was an impression. Not a footprint, not a claw mark. It was a perfect circle about the size of a dinner plate, composed of hundreds of tiny concentric suction cup-like marks. Utterly alien, utterly inexplicable. My professional detachment shattered completely. This was beyond strange flora or unusual fungi. This was something unknown, something intelligent, something other. The sallow mire wasn't just a corrupted ecosystem. It was a habitat, perhaps even a creation, of something that defied biological classification. The survey, the funding group's muted responses, the pilot's unease. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. They knew. They knew something was here, and I wasn't sent to document biodiversity. I was sent as bait. Or perhaps as a probe to see how the entity, the mire's consciousness, would react to human intrusion after decades of isolation. My blood ran cold. I was trapped miles from anywhere in the heart of an alien ecosystem deliberately observing me, perhaps preparing to assimilate me like the deer. The weekly check-in suddenly felt less like a lifeline and more like reporting back to my own unwitting executioners. The realization that I was likely bait, deliberately placed in this alien ecosystem, shifted my fear into a cold, calculating fury. The environmental group, the generous funding, the pilot's warning, it was all a setup. They weren't interested in conservation, they were studying the mire, or more accurately, the entity that seemed to govern it, using me as a disposable instrument. My survival instincts, honed by years of remote fieldwork, kicked into high gear, overriding the terror. I wasn't just going to document this place. I was going to document them, find proof of their duplicity, and find a way out. Check-in protocols be damned. But escape was a daunting prospect. Miles of impenetrable, hostile wetland lay between me and the nearest point of civilization. The helicopter wasn't due for weeks. The satellite phone felt compromised. Were my check-ins simply confirming my continued viability as bait? Could they even remotely disable it? I had to assume the worst. My immediate priority became understanding the threat, finding a weakness, and potentially finding an alternative way out. The strange, circular impression left by the nocturnal visitor became a focal point. Suction cups, a creature that moved by slithering. It defied easy categorization. I spent the next days cautiously exploring outwards from the cabin, looking for more slime trails, more impressions, trying to map the visitor's movements, understand its nature. I found more trails implied towards the letting, towards dense thickets of the pulsating, bioluminescent fungi, suggesting a connection. I also noticed the trails seemed to avoid certain areas, patches of dry, rocky ground, and surprisingly, areas near stands of a specific type of gnarled black bark tree I hadn't previously paid much attention to. Did the entity, or its physical manifestation, have limitations? Aversions? I started analyzing Finch's logbook and the tape reel from the asylum story. Wait, wrong story context. Let me correct that. I started analyzing the data I had gathered with renewed focus, looking for patterns I might have missed. The water and soil samples, the camera footage, my own observations. The unidentified organic compounds in the water, the extreme fungal saturation, the absence of typical fauna, the strange geometric patterns, the low-frequency vibrations. It painted a picture of an ecosystem completely dominated, perhaps even terraformed by a non-native, possibly extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional, intelligence manifesting through a symbiotic or controlling relationship with the pervasive fungal network. The entity wasn't just in the mire. In a very real sense, it was the mire. The deer, the slime trail creature, they weren't separate entities, but extensions, probes, or assimilated components of the larger consciousness. My next satellite check-in was tense. I reported routine findings, downplaying anything overtly anomalous, testing their reaction. As before, they were polite, detached, accepting my mundane report without question. It confirmed my suspicions. They weren't interested in ecological data. They just needed confirmation that the experiment was ongoing. I felt a cold rage build, but kept my voice level professional. After the call, I examined the sat phone. No obvious signs of tampering, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was compromised. From now on, it was only for emergencies, if it even worked then. I was truly on my own. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing camera footage near a stand of those black bark trees the slime trails seemed to avoid, I captured something extraordinary. The camera, partially obscured by dripping leaves, caught movement. Not the usual blurs or mists. A figure, humanoid in basic shape but profoundly wrong, stepped partially into view from behind one of the black trees. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs seeming to bend at odd angles. Its skin, where visible, was the color and texture of wet clay, glistening slickly. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, featureless ovoid head that tilted slightly as if sensing the camera. But the most disturbing feature was its hand, or the appendage at the end of its arm. It wasn't a hand. It was a writhing mass of pale, worm-like tendrils, tipped with those same tiny suction cups I'd seen the impression of near the cabin. The figure paused, its tendril hand questing towards the camera, then seemed to recoil, almost shuddering, before retreating rapidly behind the black bark tree and vanishing from view. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. A glimpse of one of the mire's inhabitants, or perhaps another manifestation of the central intelligence. And it avoided the black trees. Why? Did the trees possess some natural repellent property? Or were they somehow inimical to the fungal network that underpinned the entity's existence here? Armed with this crucial observation, I formulated a desperate plan. The map showed the sallow mire bordered by steep, rocky escarpments on its western edge. If I could reach that edge, perhaps I could climb out, escaping the wetland basin. The most direct route west passed through large areas dominated by the black bark trees. It would be a grueling trek, several days at least, carrying minimal supplies, abandoning the cabin and most of my equipment. But staying felt like suicide. Following the path the entity seemed to avoid offered the best, perhaps the only, chance of survival. I spent the rest of the day packing essentials: preserved food, water filter, first aid compass, knife, my handgun, more for peace of mind than any real expectation it would work against whatever these things were, and crucially samples of the black bark trees' bark and leaves, hoping they might offer some minimal protection if rubbed on my skin or clothes. Folk remedies felt suddenly appealing against fungal assimilation. As dusk fell, casting long, distorted shadows across the unnaturally silent mire, I took one last look at the cabin, my prison and failed sanctuary. Then, turning my back on the compromised sat phone and the watchful entity I knew was aware of my every move, I slipped into the deepening gloom, heading west towards the black trees, towards the forbidding escarpment, hoping to escape the sallow mire before it decided to fully integrate me into its alien, hungry ecosystem. The quiet pursuit had begun.